Hello, my name is Jake Norton, and today I will be swapping my hard disk drive, uh, more formally known as a hard drive, from my laptop for a solid state drive, or an SSD for short. Um, I'm doing this because due to a malfunction in my laptop last semester, I feel like this could help some people, mainly because I found myself against a wall, and changing it to an SSD was very beneficial for me. So going into it, what is a hard drive? A hard drive is a storage device for computers that typically uses an actuator arm to read and store data magnetically to its platters, which are rapidly rotating disks coated with magnetic materials. In layman's terms, it's where any memory on your computer is stored. And then, what is an SSD? An SSD is essentially the same thing, where it's a storage device for your computer, but it saves data in a different way by using flash memory with integrated circuits rather than magnetic storage. So then, with anything dealing with switching parts in a computer, there's always pros and cons. The main pros of a hard drive is that it is cheaper than an SSD per gigabyte, so one could get a lot more storage from a hard drive if that is what they need. Basically, you get more bang for your buck. But there's a lot of cons related to hard drives. For one, hard drives have moving parts, whether it be looking via its magnetic platter or simply because your laptop is on and being used. Because of this, finding data takes more time in comparison to an SSD, which has no moving parts and uses flash memory. Most laptops have a function where it will be idle if it is not being used, including network activity. However, this means that if the drive were to receive a physical shock while being used, such as being dropped, it is more likely that the drive will fail. As in my case, this is what happened to me because I dropped my backpack, resulting in a physical shock shaking the hard drive loose. The fact that it has to seek data and has moving parts, this can result in a whirring sound, or worse, a clicking sound when data cannot be read due to an issue with the actuator arm. Lastly, there are only two form factors that are still used, 3.5-inch for desktops and 2.5-inch for laptops. As stated, because it uses flash memory for the SSD, accessing data and overall reliability are standard feats of SSDs. Unlike hard drives, which has to physically move in order to access and write data, also with no moving parts, it is more resilient to something like physical shock and is quieter than a hard drive. For the size, the standard is usually 2.5 inches, laptop compatible, but also come in other forms of 1.8 inches and an inch. These days, other smaller flash-based storage devices such as M2 are also available, but there's always cons. Of course, with better performance comes the higher price, which turns people away from purchasing an SSD, even though it outperforms a regular hard drive. For example, the price of a 120 gigabyte SSD is about $100. At the same time of making this video, you could buy a 4 terabyte hard drive for roughly the same price, which is about 33 times more capacity than the previously stated SSD. So starting the process. A little bit of a disclaimer, unless you have done this before or know what you're doing, this should only be done if your warranty has expired or you are put in a situation where you need an upgrade as soon as possible. The risk can cause damage to your laptop if done incorrectly, but the process itself is fairly simple. Then depending on what kind of laptop you have, you may want a screwdriver as well as your replacement hard drive. Lastly, before making sure your laptop is off, so you don't run the risk of getting shocked or damaging your computer in any other way. Now for opening the computer, this is my laptop. Um, all you have to do is usually unscrew the bolt or the screws located around the edges. It's fairly simple to get it open. Then this is what it looks like inside. The arrows are showing you where the hard drive is usually located under this paper-like material surrounded by 5 screws. Using the screwdriver, we unscrew those, then we can see the hard drive chassis. And this is what it looks like. You'll see that there's a bracket surrounding it, mainly to hold the hard drive itself in place. You'll have to use the screwdriver again to get these screws off in order to get the actual hard drive. So as you can see in this slide, on the left is the mechanical hard drive that came with the laptop. Shown by the arrows, that is where the actuator arm and the platters are located, or the moving parts that I talked about earlier. On the right is the solid state drive that we're going to be putting in. As shown in its physical appearance, there are no indents for moving parts like the hard drive, so it doesn't have the actuator arm or the platters. As a general explanation for putting in the SSD is basically just retracing the steps that I previously talked about. Rescrewing the SSD into the bracket, putting the bracket back in the case, screwing it again, and then finally putting back the bottom of the laptop itself. The next step I did, which is unrelated to the process itself, is mostly trying to show statistics of why an SSD is better than a mechanical hard drive. And I use this application called Crystal DiskMark. And what it is a free disk benchmarking software which tests performance using a simulated load of a test file of a select size. The main ones that we will be focusing on is the results for SEQ and Q32T1, short for sequential for larger files, and 4 kilobyte Q32T1, which is 4 kilobyte files randomly transferred totaling up to the test file size. Without going into too much detail about what Q32T1 means, it can be broken down as Q32, meaning a queue depth of 32, and T1, meaning one or single thread of a CPU. So for the test of this recording, in order to show some statistics, I did 3 counts for 50 megabytes, as well as 1 gigabyte. For the read and write for sequential data, you can see that there's a large difference between the two speeds. They're inconsistent, comparing the megabytes per second with 87 to 105. With this being the only hard drive in my laptop, it could have been that resources were being used which slowed down the read and write of the hard drive. For the random 4 kilobyte read and write, it only does so between 0.5 megabytes and 2 megabytes. Then, as for the SSD, with it installed, I used the same test to compare what I got previously. And the difference between the two were night and day. For the SSDs, the speeds were consistent, for sequential read and write coming in at about 546 megabytes and 502 megabytes respectively, which is over 5 times as fast. For the random 4 kilobyte read and write, the gap between them widens from 10 times faster to a few hundred times faster, meaning that file transfers of a lot of small files, as well as the transfer of large files sequentially, will yield much better results on an SSD. This does not only apply to file transfers, but things such as software installations, as well as opening applications, will be much better and much smoother. In summation, there are benefits in upgrading your hard drive to an SSD. From the numbers alone, SSDs are much faster in their read and write speeds, and are a better choice for reliability as well. The main sacrifices being in capacity and price, but the overall gain is well worth it. With cloud storage being an option to combat capacity issues, as well as not relying on all data to be stored onto a single drive, with the use of external hard drives, capacity issues can be circumvented and also provide better data security by having an extra copy of your important files. I hope this has provided you with information about testing your own hardware to see if you can perform your own testing, or maybe even fix your computer if you find yourself in a situation like I did. Thank you.